Hi, I'm answering a query I get asked many a time. And yes, it is many a time and not times. It's a poetic way of saying many times. So, many a time or many times, both are okay. Okay, coming back to the topic though. Although, even though, despite, and in spite of, we are going to be talking about their usage and understanding what exactly is different between these, what you may be using incorrectly, and we're going to be correcting all those errors today. Now, first, I need you to understand that all are used to show contrast. What is contrast? So here are a few examples. Contrast is big, small, rigid, flexible, fat, thin, tall, short. These are all contrasts. So they are opposite to each other, and this is what contrasts are all about. Though, although, even though, that is what we are going to start with. I'm going to be teaching you how you can exactly frame a sentence. And after teaching that to you, I'm going to give you a small question to answer for yourself. Okay, so you start by saying the opposite. Let's say if you prefer jogging outdoors, you start by saying the opposite. Although some people prefer going to the gym, I like jogging outdoors. Okay, so I like jogging outdoors, but you keep it for the last half of the sentence, and you start by saying the opposite. Okay, I want you to try this formula now. I'll give you a question, and you use this technique to answer. Are you ready? Do you like tea or coffee for breakfast? Although some people prefer coffee for breakfast, I prefer tea early in the morning. Although or though, both of these are okay here. The formula for though, although, and even though is very simple. First, you say though, or you say although, or you say even though, and then you add the subject and then the verb. Example, although it was raining, we decided to go for a walk. So, although plus subject plus verb. Here, it is the subject. The subject is the person doing the action. The object of the statement is the one who is receiving the action. Just remember it simply. It could be anybody. Person does not mean it has to be a human being. Example, although it was raining, we decided to go for a walk. So, although it is the subject here. Was raining is the verb. Thus, the formula is although plus subject plus verb. That's how you use although, though, or even though. Another example. Although the movie received mixed reviews, I enjoyed it thoroughly. Here, the movie is the subject. Although plus subject received mixed reviews is the verb here. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Now, what you have to notice here is that after although or though, you have the subject, then the verb, then a comma. Do not forget the comma. Otherwise, it will be grammatically incorrect. Put a comma, and then comes the subject again. The subject could be you. Example, I enjoyed it thoroughly. I is the subject plus verb. So there's subject plus verb in the first half and subject plus verb in the second half after the comma. Now, we've covered a couple of examples for although. What is the difference between although and though? There is rarely any difference. The only difference is that though can be used at the end of the sentence, but although can only be used at the beginning or in the middle of a sentence. So, you can't end a sentence with although. Example, Although they were on vacation, they continued to work on their personal projects. I can very well say, though they were on vacation, they continued to work on their personal projects. No difference whatsoever, none at all. Another difference between although and though is that though is slightly more informal. So you use though more in front of your friends or your family, people you're comfortable with. But although is more suitable for formal occasions. However, that's a very small difference. Now, let's talk about even though. What is the difference between even though? I'll be covering even though in just a bit, so hang on. First, let's discuss what despite is all about. Where do you use despite? Despite is a little bit different from though and although. The formula is despite in spite of plus noun or gerund. When you use despite or in spite of, you place it right before a noun. Example, swimming is awesome. Here, swimming is a noun. It's not really a verb. I'm talking about the activity of swimming. This is the gerund form of the verb swim. Swim equals verb swimming equals gerund acting as a noun. So despite and in spite of are not followed by a subject and verb. Rather, they are followed by a noun or a gerund. Are we clear? Okay. Imagine I ask you, would you rather study science or opt for commerce? This is a very common question in many countries. Now, let's say you prefer commerce. I preferred commerce. I was a commerce graduate. You'd say, despite the advantages of studying science, I prefer commerce. I love learning about businesses. So, what do? 1. You start with despite or in spite of. 2. You place a noun or a gerund after it. 3. You put a comma and then state your preference. Another example. Despite the benefits of running early in the morning, I prefer running a little late in the evening. Here, as you can see, despite the benefits of running early, this is the noun phrase, benefits of running early. I prefer running a little late in the evening. This is my preference. One more example. Despite the calm of the countryside, I prefer living in the city. In this sentence, despite the calm of the countryside, I state the benefit of the countryside. I prefer living in the city. Then I state my preference. This is how you correctly use despite and in spite of. So this is how you frame a sentence using despite. I hope you've practiced enough. Now, if you ask me, what is the difference between despite and in spite of? There is no difference. You can very well use in spite of in any of these sentences that we just covered instead of using despite. Example, in spite of studying all night, she didn't do well on the test. Despite studying all night, she didn't do well on the test. Okay. In spite of studying all night, I am stating a contrast. She studied all night, so she was supposed to get good grades, right? But still, she didn't do well on the test. This is the contrast. Now, the same sentence can be framed exactly the same way, using despite instead of in spite of. More examples. I went to work despite my fever. I went to work in spite of my fever. When you have a fever, you're not supposed to go to work, so this sentence shows a contrast. As you can see, despite can replace in spite of in all of these sentences. There is absolutely no difference. Despite might even be a better option because it's just one word, whereas in spite of is 3 words long. But again, it's your choice. More examples with despite and in spite of. Despite studying all night, she didn't do well on the test. I went to work despite my fever. I got to the meeting on time despite heavy traffic. Everywhere, despite and in spite of are interchangeable. Both can be used at the beginning of the sentence or in the middle, but they cannot be used at the end. Now coming back to though and although, both though and although can be used at the beginning or in the middle of a sentence. The difference? Though is slightly more informal, like I told you earlier. The biggest difference is though can be used at the end of a sentence, but although cannot. So, though is more informal, and you can use it at the end, but although cannot end a sentence. Just remember that. Now, let's talk about even though. Even though also shows contrast. It is used when we are talking about two thoughts in a sentence that contradict each other. This also shows contrast, but in a much stronger way. There is a very strong emphasis on the expectation in this case. Example: even though the movie was long, they stayed engaged throughout. Usually, when movies are very long, people lose interest and keep checking their watches, thinking, Kab katam hogi, right? But in this case, they stayed engaged throughout. This is a strong contrast. Even though he dropped out of college, he became a college principal. Can you believe that? Somebody who is a dropout becomes a college principal later. Again, this is a strong contrast. Even though she was allergic to eggs, she ate the full mayonnaise. Mayonnaise has eggs in it, so logically, she shouldn't eat it. But still, she ate it. This is a strong contrast. Summary: despite and in spite of are exactly the same and can be used interchangeably. Common mistake: people say despite of, which is incorrect. She went to the office despite of her fever. Incorrect. She went to the office despite her fever. Correct. Even though shows the strongest contrast. Although and though can be used at the beginning or middle of a sentence, but only though can be used at the end. I think I'm done. Thank you very much for listening till here. Just take a look at it when you're about to sleep. Give it a little thought and then you can doze off. This is the purpose of it. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, take care of yourself. Bye-bye.